$300 was not enough to buy one tire off Vivian Whitmore Caldwell's car, but it was enough to crack open her entire empire. When the silver coupe died in front of the Sterling Grand Hotel, the ice-cold CEO ordered Elijah Rourke to fix it on the spot, promised to pay him, then drove away as though he were nothing but dust on the pavement. She had no idea the quiet single father used to sign safety reports that made an entire industry stand at attention. One torn invoice, one signature treated like garbage. And a $30 million luxury car deal was about to come apart at the seams, one quiet decision at a time, starting the very next morning. If a story about dignity outlasting money speaks to you, stay until the very end, because sometimes the smallest unpaid debt is the one that brings down an empire. The Phoenix sun sat high and merciless over the glass towers downtown, throwing hard white light across the circular driveway of the Sterling Grand Hotel, where a woman in a tailored white suit stepped out of a black town car like she owned the pavement beneath her heels. Vivian Whitmore Caldwell moved the way people move when they have never once been told to wait, her sunglasses catching the light, her assistant trotting 2 steps behind with a leather folder pressed to her chest. Somewhere upstairs, in a suite reserved for men who did not need to be impressed, Sterling Bancroft III was finishing his morning coffee, waiting to sign a deal that would put 48 limited edition vehicles into his private holdings for a total of $30 million. For Vivienne, this contract was not simply business. It was oxygen. Caldwell Meridian Automotive Group had spent 2 quarters bleeding money in silence, and this single signature was supposed to stop the bleeding for good. Behind the polished press releases and the framed magazine covers hanging in her office lobby, Caldwell Meridian Automotive Group was a company running on fumes and appearances, its cash reserves thinner than any board member dared say aloud in a public meeting. Vivienne had inherited the company from her grandfather, a man who built its reputation one careful decision at a time, and she had spent the last 3 years trying to prove she could grow it twice as fast, without ever once slowing down to ask whether the foundation could bear the weight. The Bancroft contract was not a bonus deal to her. It was the one signature standing between a headline about record growth and a headline about a family name quietly sliding into irrelevance, and she intended to walk out of that hotel with it secured no matter what stood in her way that morning. Her personal coupe, a silver custom build worth more than $400,000, chose that exact morning to die. The dashboard blinked red, the trunk locked itself shut, and the onboard computer slid into a stubborn safety mode that refused every command her own technician tried from his phone 12 miles away. Vivienne stood on the curb with her arms folded, watching the minutes bleed off the clock, less than 1 hour standing between her and the room where Sterling Bancroft was waiting. A hotel valet, sweating through his uniform, remembered a mechanic who had dropped off parts at a garage 2 blocks over not 10 minutes earlier, and before Vivienne could object, he was already waving the man down. Elijah Rourke pulled his old pickup truck against the curb, stepped out in a plain work shirt with grease still dark under his fingernails, and walked toward the coupe without any of the nervous energy the moment seemed to demand. Vivienne looked him over the way a person looks over something they intend to send back, her mouth curling faintly. She asked, in a voice sharpened for exactly this purpose, whether he actually knew how to touch a car like this one. Elijah did not answer the insult. He crouched by the open hood, ran his hand along a cluster of wires, and within 90 seconds had already isolated a failed thermal sensor tied directly into the vehicle's safety module, a detail her own dealership technicians had missed twice that year. He quoted her $300 for the emergency repair, diagnostics included, a temporary connector swapped in, and the system reset by hand. Vivienne exhaled sharply and told her assistant to note it down, promising payment the moment the car was running again. Elijah worked with the same unhurried precision a surgeon might bring to a much smaller incision, and within 20 minutes the coupe's engine turned over clean, its dashboard light settling into a calm, steady green. Vivian slid into the driver's seat without a word of thanks, already dialing her assistant about the meeting upstairs, and as the car eased away from the curb, she called back over her shoulder that he should send the invoice to her office, and if they found it worth paying, they would pay it. Elijah stood on the sidewalk long after the silver car disappeared into traffic, an unsigned invoice for $300 folded once in his hand. He had met people like her before, back when he still wore a company badge and sat in rooms where his opinion mattered more than his appearance, and he recognized the particular arrogance of someone who had never once had to wonder whether a bill would get paid. It did not anger him the way it might have angered a younger man. It simply confirmed something he already understood about the world he had chosen to leave behind, that money could buy silence far more easily than it could buy honesty, and that most people with enough of it rarely noticed the difference until it cost them something larger. He mailed the invoice that same afternoon, attaching the fault code, a photograph of the burned connector, the timestamp, and the flat repair cost, nothing more and nothing less. 3 days passed without a single word back. When he finally called the corporate office, he was passed between 4 different extensions before landing on Camden Vale, the company's in-house counsel, whose voice carried the practiced warmth of a man who had delivered bad news for a living. Camden explained, with the smooth patience of someone reading from memory, that the repair had never been formally approved, and so the company held no obligation to cover it. Elijah reminded him calmly that Vivian herself had requested the repair and agreed to the price in front of hotel staff. Camden laughed softly, the kind of laugh meant to sting without ever raising its voice, and said that a roadside mechanic would find it difficult proving a verbal agreement with a chief executive. There was no shouting on Elijah's end, no plea, only a steadiness that made the injustice land harder for anyone listening. He said simply that he did not need $300 badly enough to lose his self-respect chasing it, but that Vivian needed to understand what a signature was worth. When Camden reported the exchange, Vivian barely looked up from her tablet. $300 was not even a rounding error to her, and she told him to erase the invoice entirely, muttering that she was not interested in setting a precedent where every mechanic in the city felt entitled to chase her down for money. It was a small moment, almost forgettable, and that was exactly what made it dangerous, because the same week, on the other side of the city, Harper Sloan, head of procurement for Bancroft Sovereign Holdings, was finalizing the paperwork that would decide whether the $30 million deal actually closed. She requested full documentation, safety certifications, warranty terms, and independent inspection reports for every vehicle in the shipment. Harper had built her entire career on a simple, unglamorous principle that a deal was only as sound as the paperwork behind it, and after 2 decades in procurement for one of the wealthiest holding companies in the country, she had learned to trust a spreadsheet over a smile every single time. She did not know Vivian personally, and she did not care to. Her only obligation was to Sterling Bancroft and the fleet of executives who would eventually sit inside these vehicles, and she was not about to let a rushed signature put a single one of them at risk. Camden assured Vivian the paperwork was nearly complete, missing only a secondary confirmation on the thermal safety module, the very same system Elijah had diagnosed less than a week earlier. Vivian did not connect the name to the mechanic from the curb. In her memory, he was simply the man who had tried to squeeze $300 out of her for 10 minutes of work. Then Harper's email arrived with one final requirement before signature, an independent inspection from a certified consultant on Bancroft's pre-approved list. The very first name on that list was Elijah Rourke. Rourke and Wren Auto Works sat at the edge of an industrial strip, a modest garage with clean concrete floors, tools hung in exact rows, and a wall of old certificates yellowing quietly behind the front counter. There was no sign advertising anything, no attempt to impress. In the corner of the office, a small backpack hung off the back of a chair, a lunchbox sat unopened on the desk, and a text message on Elijah's phone reminded him to pick up his son Noah from his grandmother's house that weekend. He was a single father, and though the story never lingered long on that fact, it sat quietly underneath every decision he made. Years earlier, Elijah had been a senior safety engineer for one of the country's premier luxury automakers, the kind of man whose signature could greenlight or freeze an entire production line. After an internal dispute over safety standards that management wanted quietly buried, he had walked away from the corporate ladder entirely, choosing instead to open a small garage where he could raise his son on his own terms and never again be asked to sign something he did not believe. He rarely spoke of that history, but insurance firms, private collectors, and certain corporate fleets still kept his name filed away, because a report bearing Elijah Rourke's signature carried weight that no amount of polish could fake. The dispute that pushed him out had never made headlines, and he had never wanted it to. A production line had been ready to ship a batch of vehicles with a component he considered unreliable under sustained stress, and when his warning was quietly shelved in favor of a shipping deadline, he chose to walk rather than let his name sit on something he could not stand behind. Noah had been barely 2 years old at the time, and Elijah remembered thinking, as he cleared out his desk, that there were certain trades he was simply not willing to make for anyone, no matter how large the paycheck. Sterling Bancroft himself had hired Elijah 2 years earlier, after a costly mechanical failure overseas nearly ended in tragedy for one of his executives. Since then, Elijah's name had remained permanently on the short list of independent consultants Bancroft trusted without question. When Harper's email arrived requesting an inspection of the very fleet Caldwell Meridian intended to sell, Elijah opened the specification sheets and immediately recognized the same faulty module family he had pulled a burned connector from just days earlier, on a silver coupe outside a hotel he had almost forgotten about. He did not rush toward revenge. He simply placed the unpaid $300 invoice into a folder beside his diagnostic notes, and understood that something far larger than a missed payment was sitting quietly at the center of this deal. If Caldwell Meridian had known about a defective module and pushed the sale forward anyway, an entire fleet worth $30 million could be delivered with a hidden risk baked into its wiring. He wrote back to Harper agreeing to the inspection, but he requested full maintenance history, error logs, and the most recent repair records for every test vehicle, one of which, though nobody yet realized it, was the very same silver coupe. Inside Caldwell Meridian's headquarters, the air had turned tense enough to feel through the walls. Harper informed the room that Bancroft would not proceed without an independent report from Elijah Rourke specifically. Vivienne did not immediately place the name, and it was only when her assistant reminded her that this was the mechanic from outside the hotel that her expression shifted into something close to disbelief. A $300 mechanic now stood, quite literally, between her and $30 million. Camden suggested finding another consultant, but Harper made it clear that Bancroft would only accept one of 3 names, 2 of whom were currently overseas. Vivienne called Elijah herself, her voice dressed up as a favor, offering to reconsider paying the old invoice if he would simply sign the report quickly. Elijah answered without much ceremony, telling her that paying an old invoice was one matter entirely separate from an honest safety report. She pressed him, asking what figure would move things along faster. Elijah did not ask for more money. He asked only for full access to the vehicles, the raw data, and no interference from her legal team. This unsettled Vivienne far more than she's show. Oh, 'cause raw, unfiltered data could easily reveal that Caldwell Meridian had known about the module defect and delayed the fix simply to close the deal on schedule. Camden stepped in, sliding across a non-disclosure agreement written broadly enough to silence Elijah on anything unfavorable to the company. Elijah read it slowly, drew a single line through one clause, and told them plainly that he would sign for trade confidentiality, but he would not sign away silence over a safety failure. The exchange was quiet, almost polite on the surface, yet every sentence landed like a blade. Vivienne wielding her position, Elijah answering only with principle, never once raising his voice. Camden had drafted hundreds of agreements over his career, most of them signed without a second glance by people eager to collect a paycheck, and it clearly unsettled him that a man in work boots had actually read every clause before setting down his pen. He tried once more to widen the language, framing it as standard procedure, but Elijah simply slid the page back across the table and told him that standard procedure was not the same thing as fair, and he had learned the difference the hard way, years earlier, in a much larger office than this one. She finally allowed the inspection, already quietly instructing Camden to prepare a narrative painting Elijah as a man with a personal grudge over $300, someone whose objectivity could later be questioned if needed. When Elijah stepped into Caldwell Meridian's inspection center that afternoon, photographs of Vivienne shaking hands with billionaires lined the walls above him, while 48 gleaming vehicles sat arranged in flawless rows below. He looked over the fleet for a long moment and said quietly to himself that beautiful did not automatically mean safe. The air in the inspection center smelled of fresh leather and polish. Every surface buffed to a shine meant to dazzle a buyer walking through for 30 seconds, not a technician planning to spend the entire afternoon underneath the hood. Elijah rolled up his sleeves, pulled a laptop from his bag that looked nothing like the sleek diagnostic tablets the Caldwell technicians carried, and set it on the hood of the first vehicle without a trace of self-consciousness. He worked the way he always worked, slow enough to be thorough, and fast enough that nobody watching ever mistook it for hesitation. Elijah began his inspection with the same discipline he brought to every job. No anger driving his hands, only method. He checked thermal logs, battery cycles, door control units, automatic locking systems, and every software update pushed to the fleet in the past year. At first, everything appeared clean, and the technicians standing behind him watched with quiet skepticism, certain this was simply a lucky garage mechanic playing dress-up in a role beyond him. Then he began reading the raw error codes by hand instead of trusting the summarized dashboard, and he found an irregular reset cycle that had been quietly masked behind a temporary software patch. The room went still. What he found matched the exact fault from the Silver Coupe days earlier, a connector inside the thermal safety module, capable of reporting false temperature readings during sustained high heat. In a private vehicle, that meant a stall on the side of the road. In a luxury fleet meant for high-value clients, it meant the very real possibility of multiple vehicles locking down mid-journey. He requested the maintenance history for Vivienne's own coupe. Camden hesitated before producing it, and Elijah reminded him that Harper had already required this exact documentation. When the file finally arrived, it was missing any record of the emergency repair performed outside the hotel just days earlier, an omission that spoke louder than any denial could. Elijah placed his own $300 invoice on the table, complete with a photograph of the failed connector, the date, the location, and the exact part number. What had been dismissed as a nuisance charge had quietly become the single piece of evidence proving Caldwell Meridian had been warned about this defect before the contract was ever signed. Vivienne tried to argue it was an isolated incident, but Elijah pulled hidden data from 3 additional test vehicles showing the identical warning sequence. The mood in the room shifted from condescension to something closer to fear. Harper requested an emergency meeting with Sterling Bancroft himself, and Vivian understood immediately that if Elijah's report went forward unedited, the $30 million deal would freeze completely. She excused herself to the hallway, her heels striking the polished floor in a rhythm that betrayed far more urgency than her expression let on, and dialed Camden with instructions to find any angle, any leverage, anything at all that might slow the process down long enough for her to regain control of the room. Camden reminded her, carefully, that slowing things down would not make the defect disappear, only delay the moment everyone eventually had to face it. Vivian told him that a delay was exactly what she needed, because a delay still left room for negotiation, and negotiation was the only language she had ever truly trusted. She pulled him into the hallway, her tone suddenly softer, offering $30,000 if he would simply phrase the report a little more gently. Elijah looked at her for a long moment before answering with the line that closed the exchange for good. He told her that she had once refused to pay $300 for the truth, and now she was offering $30,000 to make it disappear. Vivian refused to accept defeat so easily. She pivoted toward discrediting Elijah instead of the facts. Camden drafted a memo suggesting Elijah harbored a personal grievance against the company over the unpaid invoice, implying his findings could not be considered objective, and sent it directly to Harper's office before the next session began. The memo forced a pause in proceedings. Sterling Bancroft had not yet appeared in person, but his office demanded a full, transparent account from every party involved. For a brief moment, Vivian believed she had regained control of the narrative, her confidence returning as quickly as it had drained away. Elijah understood exactly what was happening, and he refused to defend himself with emotion. Instead, he handed over everything at once: the original invoice email, time-stamped photographs of the failed connector, a written statement from hotel staff confirming Vivian's verbal agreement, and lobby security footage showing the exact moment she authorized the repair and left minutes later. Most damaging of all was the coup's own automated diagnostic record, proving the module failure had occurred well before the contract negotiations reached their final stage. It meant Caldwell Meridian could no longer claim ignorance of the defect at any point in the process. Vivian tried one last angle, insisting Elijah was an outside mechanic, with no standing to render judgment on a commercial vehicle line. That was when Harper produced his full professional record: former senior safety engineer, the man who had once caught a critical defect in a European vehicle line before it reached production, and a Bancroft-approved consultant for 3 consecutive years. The turning point in the room was almost physical. People who had looked at Elijah as nothing more than roadside labor now sat up straighter, their expressions rearranging themselves in real time. Even Caldwell's own technical staff stayed silent, unwilling to challenge data this precise and this thoroughly documented. Vivian lost her composure for just a moment, saying in front of the entire room that a single father moonlighting as a mechanic had no business derailing her company's future. The comment landed with a chill Harper did not bother to hide, because for Bancroft, a supplier's culture of contempt toward working people was its own kind of liability, one no contract clause could fully insure against. Harper had sat across the table from dozens of executives over the years, and she had learned that the way a company treated the people it considered beneath it in a boardroom was almost always the same way it treated safety warnings, customer complaints, and every other inconvenient truth that threatened a quarterly forecast. She made a note in the margin of her folder, not of the technical findings, but of the sentence Vivian had just spoken out loud, because she suspected Sterling would want to hear that one word for word. Before the session closed, Harper announced the deal was not yet canceled, but it would move to a special review panel the following morning. Vivian had one night to save her contract. Elijah had one night to finish his report. Elijah returned to the garage well after dark, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, no dramatic collapse in his posture, only the quiet exhaustion of an ordinary man pulled into a war that belonged to people far wealthier than himself. He brewed coffee, opened his laptop, and worked back through every line of data one final time, checking and rechecking numbers that would decide far more than his own $300. His phone buzzed once. Noah's voice came through small and hopeful, asking whether his father would make it home in time for the weekend. Elijah smiled despite the weight sitting on his shoulders and told his son he was finishing up something a little bigger than usual. The moment passed in seconds, quiet and warm, a reminder of exactly why any of this mattered to him at all. After he hung up, Elijah sat for a while without touching the keyboard, looking at the photograph taped to the edge of his monitor. Noah, at 6 years old, grinning with a missing front tooth outside this very garage. He had built this life deliberately, board by board, appointment by appointment, and no amount of pressure from a woman with a corner office was going to convince him to trade its steadiness for anything, least of all her approval. He rolled his shoulders once, refilled his coffee, and went back to the data with the same patience he brought to everything else. Deep in the data, Elijah found the detail that changed everything. The faulty module had not slipped through by accident at the technician level. It had been chosen deliberately during the final production run to cut costs and protect profit margins, a decision that required executive sign-off. He traced Camden's electronic signature on the supplier change order, but the final approval, the one that mattered, belonged to Vivian alone. What had started as a $300 dispute had quietly become the loose thread capable of unraveling an entire chain of concealment. Across town, inside her penthouse, Vivian sat with Camden and a small communications team, weighing options that ranged from blaming a minor parts supplier to painting Elijah as a man exaggerating a defect purely out of spite over unpaid wages. For a moment, she considered simply telling the truth and asking for time to fix it. Camden, to his credit, suggested it too, proposing a voluntary disclosure and a revised timeline that might have preserved both the deal and what remained of the company's credibility. Vivian turned the idea over for exactly as long as it took to remember every headline she had ever read about a CEO admitting fault in public, and decided the risk to her own name outweighed whatever goodwill honesty might buy her. But pride won out in the end, and she decided that in the morning she would apply direct pressure on Sterling Bancroft himself, still convinced that billionaires protected their own kind before they ever sided with a mechanic from a strip mall garage. By the time Elijah finished his report, the language inside it carried no anger at all, only data, photographs, timestamps, risk assessments, and a single clear recommendation: delay delivery of the entire fleet until every defective module had been replaced. He printed 2 copies before switching off the lights. One was the safety report, capable of saving what remained of Caldwell Meridian's reputation. The other was the overdue $300 invoice, proof of exactly why that reputation was already crumbling. Morning arrived hot and bright over downtown Phoenix, sunlight sliding across the top-floor conference room of the Sterling Grand Hotel, where a long wooden table sat prepared with the $30 million contract resting inside its leather binder. Vivian walked in first, composed and cold, determined to hold on to whatever authority remained to her. Camden sat beside her, ready to counter every objection. Harper represented Bancroft Sovereign Holdings, and Sterling Bancroft III arrived last, unhurried, saying almost nothing as he took his seat at the head of the table. Elijah entered wearing a clean, simple shirt, no expensive suit, only a folder of documents under one arm. Vivian glanced at him the way she might glance at something that had wandered into the wrong room, but Elijah's expression remained perfectly even, unaffected by the weight of the setting around him. He took the seat offered to him near the end of the table set his folder down without ceremony, and waited the same way he waited for a customer to finish complaining about a bill before he explained exactly what their car needed. Nothing about the room intimidated him, not the view of the city through floor-to-ceiling glass, not the leather binder holding $30 million, not even the silence that settled over the table the moment everyone realized he had no intention of speaking first. Vivienne opened with a polished speech about Caldwell Meridian's commitment to quality, 100 years of reputation, and the promise of an elite fleet worthy of Bancroft's name, framing the entire situation as nothing more than a small misunderstanding with an independent supplier. Harper turned the floor over to Elijah, and he did not open with the story of an unpaid invoice. He laid out the module failure, the chain of supporting data, the photographs of the burned connector, the risk of system lockdown in sustained heat, and a clear, honest estimate of both repair cost and required time. Camden attempted to attack Elijah's motives directly, suggesting personal bias tainted his conclusions. That was the exact moment Elijah placed the $300 invoice on the table in full view of everyone present. He explained plainly that the invoice was never the reason for his report. It was simply proof that Caldwell Meridian had known about the defect long before the contract was ever signed. Harper asked Vivienne why no formal record existed of the roadside repair. Vivienne stumbled through an answer. Camden called it an unofficial fix, something outside standard procedure. Elijah answered with a single line that settled quietly over the room. Unofficial did not mean it never happened. Sterling Bancroft finally spoke, his voice calm, almost gentle, carrying more weight than anything said before it. He asked Vivienne directly why he should hand over $30 million to a company that could not find it in itself to honor an honest $300 debt. Silence spread across the table like something physical, heavy enough to feel in the chest. Sterling had built his own fortune from nothing, starting in a rented office with 3 employees and a phone line that rarely rang, and he had never forgotten what it felt like to be underestimated by people who assumed money and manners always traveled together. He looked at Elijah for a moment, not with pity, but with the quiet recognition of one self-made man noticing another, and then he looked back at Vivienne, waiting for an answer he already suspected she could not give him. Harper announced that Bancroft Sovereign Holdings would suspend the signing indefinitely and open discussions with alternative suppliers. Vivienne's face drained of color, though she was not yet fully broken, still clinging to whatever leverage she believed remained. Once the formal session ended, Vivienne pulled Sterling aside, appealing to old family connections, shared charity events, mutual acquaintances across the business world, hoping personal history might succeed where data had failed. Sterling listened without expression and remained entirely unmoved. He told her plainly that the mechanical defect itself was fixable given enough time and money. What could not be repaired so easily was a culture willing to belittle a working person, conceal important data, and attempt to discredit an independent expert simply for telling the truth in a room full of powerful people. Harper delivered the final decision without ceremony. Bancroft Sovereign Holdings was formally canceling the $30 million agreement with Caldwell Meridian Automotive Group, and the matter would additionally be reported to the industry's Supplier Standards Board. Vivienne turned toward Elijah, her expression somewhere between fury and disbelief, telling him he had destroyed her company over $300. Elijah answered quietly that she had done that to herself the moment she decided $300 was too small an amount to deserve basic decency. Camden tried to slip quietly out of the room, but Harper stopped him, requesting that every internal communication related to the defective module be preserved for review, a clear signal that legal and professional consequences were only beginning for Caldwell Meridian's leadership. Before leaving, Sterling paused beside Elijah and handed him a business card. He explained that Bancroft Sovereign Holdings needed someone to oversee independent safety standards across their entire North American fleet, an opportunity that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with the competence Elijah had just demonstrated in front of the room. Vivian remained behind after everyone else had gone, standing alone by the window, watching the city stretch out beneath her while the folder holding her collapsed contract sat closed on the table. Nearby, the $300 invoice remained exactly where Elijah had left it, small and unremarkable, and yet somehow heavier than the entire ruined deal beside it. In the weeks that followed, Caldwell Meridian's shareholders demanded answers, and the specialized trade press began asking pointed questions about the defective module and the company's treatment of an outside contractor. Vivian could no longer control the story the way she once had. The board of directors ordered a full internal investigation, and although Camden tried to shift blame onto lower-level technical staff, Elijah's documentation made clear that the decision to swap in a cheaper component had been approved at the executive level, forcing Vivian to step aside temporarily while the audit continued. Reporters who had once written glowing profiles about her rapid rise now filed far less flattering pieces, quoting unnamed sources inside the company, who described a culture where warnings from the factory floor rarely made it past middle management before being smoothed over or ignored entirely. Vivian read every article alone in her apartment, the curtains drawn against a city that no longer looked quite as impressed with her as it once had. And for the first time in years she found herself with nothing scheduled, no meeting to rush toward, no deal waiting to be closed. One quiet afternoon, Vivian arrived at Elijah's garage alone, no assistants trailing behind her, no luxury car waiting at the curb. She carried a check for $300 along with the accrued late fee, but Elijah did not simply accept it. He asked her to sign a short confirmation that the original work had been completed exactly as agreed, a small formality that carried far more weight than its size suggested. For the first time, Vivian signed a document Elijah placed in front of her rather than the other way around. It was a small gesture, yet it carried an unmistakable symbolism. The woman who once treated his signature as worthless, now forced to put her own name beneath his terms. She looked around the garage while she signed, taking in the neat rows of tools, the certificates on the wall, the quiet order of a business built without a single dollar of outside investment, and something in her expression suggested she was seeing the place, and the man who ran it, for the very first time. She asked, almost hesitant, whether he had done all of this out of a desire for revenge. Elijah told her honestly that he had not. He said that even if she had paid him the $300 on the very first day, he still would have reported the defective module. But Caldwell Meridian might have had the chance to correct the problem quietly before Bancroft ever lost faith in them. Vivian said nothing for a long moment. It was in that silence that the real lesson finally seemed to land, that the failure had never truly been about money, but about how she chose to treat someone who did not appear powerful on the surface. Elijah accepted the payment at last, though there was no triumph in the gesture. He stamped the invoice paid and filed it away in a drawer beside a dozen others just like it. For him, the matter of $300 was closed. What mattered far more was the respect that had quietly been returned to him in the process. Before the week was out, Harper called to confirm that Bancroft Sovereign Holdings wanted a long-term consulting agreement with Elijah, one substantial enough to expand his garage and finally bring on additional mechanics to help carry the growing workload. Elijah did not become a billionaire overnight, and the story never pretended he should. What he gained instead was something far more durable than sudden wealth. Recognition earned entirely on the strength of his own name. The story closed several weeks later. Rourke and Wren Auto Works had been modestly upgraded, A fresh sign above the door, 2 additional lifts installed, and an appointment book that stayed full from morning until close. Elijah still wore the same simple work shirt, still inspected every vehicle himself before it left his garage, unchanged by anything that had happened in that conference room. Noah appeared only briefly near the very end, jogging past the open bay door to ask if they were having pizza that night. The moment was short and warm, nothing more, a reminder that Elijah's victory had never been about power at all, only about protecting the quiet, steady life he had built for the two of them. Bancroft ultimately signed with a different supplier after every vehicle in their proposed fleet was re-inspected under standards Elijah himself had helped define. Harper told him plainly that any company hoping to work with Bancroft going forward would first need to meet a new benchmark that had quietly come to be known, inside the company at least, as the Rourke Standard. Vivian did not vanish from the story entirely. The board eventually replaced her, though before she stepped away, she wrote Elijah a short letter of apology. The story never asked the audience to see her as fully redeemed, only to understand that her own arrogance had finally been forced into the light where she could no longer look away from it. Elijah read the letter once, folded it carefully, and set it aside without writing back. He did not need an apology to keep moving forward. He already had steady work, an intact sense of dignity, and a calm that no amount of money had ever been able to buy him. Whatever Vivienne became after that letter was no longer his concern. His own path had been set long before she ever pulled up outside that hotel. In the final scene, a gleaming luxury car pulled up outside the garage, its owner stepping out with a faint note of condescension in his voice, asking whether Elijah was really equipped to handle a vehicle this expensive. Elijah glanced toward his appointment book, its pages filled with the names of major companies who now trusted him without question, and answered simply that he only fixed what was actually worth fixing. Word traveled slowly through Phoenix's business circles the way it always does, one conversation at a time, until people who had never met Elijah personally still recognized his name whenever a supplier's safety record came under question. He never went looking for that reputation. He built it the same way he built everything else, one honest job at a time, one small promise kept when it would have been easier to let it slide. Late one evening, long after the garage had gone quiet, and the last customer of the day had driven off satisfied, Elijah sat at his desk and looked once more at the framed photograph of Noah, then at the small stack of thank-you notes that had started arriving from clients he had never expected to hear from again. He thought, not for the first time, that the entire ordeal had never really been about a car, or a contract, or even the $300 that started it all. It had been about the simple, stubborn belief that a person's word should still mean something, no matter how much or how little money sat behind it. The story ends on that quiet echo, the understanding that sometimes it is not a massive lawsuit or an elaborate scheme that brings down an empire, but a single ordinary moment when someone powerful convinces themselves it is acceptable to cheat a decent man out of $300.